My claim is that the U.S. embargo on Cuba should be lifted for three main reasons. The first being that they have recently, geologists, both U.S. and Cuban, have reason to believe that there are large oil reserves off the coast of Cuba. The second reason being that the Cuban embargo, instead of protecting our national security, is that instead it actually hinders our national security. And the third argument being that medical supplies that are very, very badly needed throughout the world aren't getting to certain patients because of the Cuban embargo. Okay, first off, U.S. geologists believe that there are 5 billion barrels of oil down in the Cuban coast. Cuban geologists, which have more readily access to the Cuban coast itself, believe that there are actually 20 billion barrels of crude oil that the entire world could be using to solve a lot of our financial issues if the U.S. were to actually invest in that, rather than, in fact, several European and Asian countries are now trying to figure out many, many ways to work around the Cuban embargo itself. They're not allowed to have any oil rigs out there without excessive fines from the U.S., the Cuban embargo itself. So to work around it, they had to actually invest in a submarine that would go around drilling for oil. Thus far, they have not found any oil, but if it weren't for the Cuban embargo, it would be much faster to build oil rigs than to transport the $500,000 submarine from area to area and drill for a few hours. The Scarabeo 9 is the submarine itself. It's a 380-foot long behemoth. Costs $500,000 a day to rent, and they have to drive it, as in move it from Asia down to Cuba, which is quite a long haul. Yes, it's because of the Cuban embargo. The submarine, the law is that it can't use machinery that uses more than 20% of parts made in America for dealings in Cuba. As a result, they had to rent the submarine, which is made of 10% American parts. These kind of ideas, these designs, these raw materials are incredibly rare because the U.S. does make majority of the nicer components that the world uses. The second thing is that if they do find crude oil, there are no oil rigs out there to catch the oil, so they would have to suck it up with the submarine and then lug it back. With the excess weight already in the submarine, it would increase overall cost to travel, and as a result, increase overall costs of the oil when sold to the general public. And according to Orsi from the Bloomberg Business Week, if they do find oil in Cuba, we probably do not want Castro to be in control of it, investment or not, because they are a communist country. The whole point of the embargo is we don't want communism rising, and oil is a very good motivator for politics. The second one is that it hinders our national security, just the same. The Cuban embargo, if we're not investing in the oil ourselves and we're not looking for it, then how can we in any way hinder Cuban or communist overtake of certain nationalities when Cuba will have all the oil if they find it down there? Also, Cuba is not a terrorist threat as far as we know, yet we can't exchange information with them when we're trying to look for potential criminals, and just the same, they can't exchange information with us. So wanted men in America could easily escape to Cuba and not be seen ever again. More than 70% of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets, when they search people in airports, is primarily from Cuba to find nothing really more than cigar and rum, whereas they could use that 70% of searches on possible threats to national security, such as terrorists. Also, without the free exchange of ideas between America and the U.S. imposed by the Cuban embargo, they don't know what it's like in the U.S., and we don't know what it's really like in Cuba. Some of the tours that have been allowed over there, it's somewhat like North Korea. They're allowed to see some things and not allowed to see others. Raul and Fidel Castro actually blame the excessive poverty in Cuba on the American embargo, and people believe them because they don't have anything else to listen to. Trade with them would naturally increase travel, increase the number of products they have there, and they would have a better understanding of what goes on in the U.S. from what certain travel agencies have told about Cuba, they often have ambulances that will not have gas to save people, but they'll have roving police officers who actually aren't there to uphold the law, they're there to uphold the censorship. And those will be between 10 and 50 cars. There will always be fully gassed where ambulances will be empty. How can you save lives when you're trying to hold people down? The embargo itself is in bad taste with the entire world. Nobody really wants it, and yet the U.S. continues to impose it. We actually, in fact, trade with countries that have done worse crimes than Cuba, as far as we know. There is the country called Myanmar, who is known to use human genocide as one of their political tools, and yet we freely trade with them. We freely trade with China, even though they're communist, and communism is the entire reason we imposed the Cuban embargo. Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, we recently opened up trade with them in the 1970s, even though they had very, very inhumane practices. And in the minute that I have left, the main points in this is that products in Cuba, medicines, that they can't get to the raw materials that US will offer, and as a result, they can't make the medicines which would be at a third the cost to the entire world. So countries in third world countries, if they can't afford medicines from the US, if there weren't for the Cuban embargo, they could afford medicines from Cuba that are of the same quality.